Hey everyone, so part two of week 4. I want to concentrate on one particularly important aspect of the development of photography in the 19th century, the portrait, the photographic portrait. Now, historically, portraiture has been linked with the wealthy in society. Those who had portraits of themselves or family members could afford to hire an artist and had the time available to them to sit for an artist to record them in this way. So the portrait has been closely linked historically with, this sort of aristocracy and nobility. If you go through portrait galleries and look at portraits from hundreds of years ago, you don't get Joe Schmo from the street who's got a portrait. It is always, a king, a queen, etc., etc. So they've always been linked with the wealthy. Portraits could be pictures of the self, or they could be family or estates, for examples, and they're a public act of display of status, wealth, land, and property. If you like, an act of class warfare, because the display of a portrait, and indeed the commissioning of a portrait, is in itself a statement of class, and to display that portrait, therefore, is an indication of one's class in comparison to other classes in society. So portraiture has had this kind of relationship to class and wealth throughout the history of Western Europe. For example, here's a portrait of Mr. and Mrs. Andrews from 1750 by Thomas Gainsborough. And, draw attention here to, what is in this image. You have the kind of, I don't know about happy, but you have the couple sat here, and you can you can interpret from this image that, behind them is their estate. They've asked Gainsborough to capture the estate for them. The gentleman stood upright, the lady sat down. This is a clear indication not just of class but of gender relations in the 18th century. He's carrying a shooter as well. It doesn't mean he's going to knock over the local loft license, but he is of the landed gentry, he is of the hunting class, etc. That's an indicator of class itself. And yeah, it reeks of privilege. It absolutely stinks of privilege. And, it's one of Gainsborough's famous works, but, it is a classic example of the kind of things that portraiture would capture. So, photographic portraits come in after the development of the daguerreotype, really. So photography is obviously ideal for portraits because you can capture the detail of the image and the features of people and so on. The use of protective cases with things like daguerreotypes made them into a treasured object, and people literally hadn't seen themselves before. This kind of freaks people out when I say that, but you might say, oh, what about mirrors? And you say, well, yeah, but you don't see yourself in a mirror because it's a reflection. You actually see the reverse of what you look like. People had actually literally never seen themselves previously. They'd seen reflections of themselves, or maybe there's some people out there who might have had a portrait, but as I'm emphasizing here, portraiture was quite rare and was reserved for those who could afford to have it done. And indeed, the portrait is not necessarily an accurate representation of the person in it. Very often artists would make the person look a little better than they actually were in a portrait in order to sort of please them and maybe have a future commission and so on. So, the subjectivity of art, I guess, means that the portrait as painted or as drawn is not 100% accurate representation. Whereas, of course, the image captured by a photograph is, reasonably speaking, that kind of representation. Now, when the daguerreotype started, you had a lot of problems, though, with actually doing portrait photographs because of the exposure times that these images had. This is an example of a brace used to keep people still for sufficient time for the image to develop on the metal plate. You had long exposure times. You had to, through that exposure time, fix your expression and stance. So here is, if you look at the top there, point R, there's fixings going on there, not just for the neck, but also to keep the face muscles in place. So this is actually quite painful. To have a photographic representation of oneself in this way would actually be quite painful itself. It's very uncomfortable. You've got body and neck clamps. people sat at tables and chairs all the time and having to sit absolutely still, or otherwise the daguerreotype would not capture the image properly. You know, it would be kind of ruined. So yeah, not what we might call ideal. To give you an example of, you know, what I'm talking about here in terms of exposure times, in 1839, a daguerreotype half plate would take 15 minutes to develop. That's uncomfortable. A whole plate, 30 minutes. You had to stay absolutely stationary. Virtually impossible. So by 41, things had improved, and you're talking now, the longest you'd have to be there is 90 seconds. But you try standing completely still, motionless for 90 seconds. Really, really difficult. And even by 42, and you can see that, you know, there's a rapid improvement in the technology here. But even like standing completely still for 10 seconds, I don't know if I could do that. You know, I'm blinking, you know, I'm gesturing, I'm moving, you know, I'm a fidget. None of that with the daguerreotype. You would ruin the process. So even doing it for 10 seconds is actually a challenge. But looking past the actual physical discomfort of doing this, you have daguerreotype mania. By 1842, obviously reduced exposure times, the method had improved, the images have become cheaper as well. And you have the development of portrait studios using daguerreotypes. These became readily available for the middle classes, turning the image into a commodity and an object of mass consumption. And really, the portrait studio itself was organized like a factory. You know, it had that kind of industrial logic to it. An image of that will help you understand this. So in terms of the studio itself, you have all these people around here who, you know, you enter at a particular point. Everyone has got their own role within this sort of factory of image making. We have people to do hair, people to apply makeup, whatever. You've got people to, you know, you do the image, develop so once the image has been captured, it's passed on to be developed, it's passed on to be housed. So you get the emergence of an entire industry around daguerreotype production, where each portrait studio would have several people working on very specific jobs in order to make this process as logical and efficient as possible. And then, of course, the more efficient it is, the more people you can have in, and the more money you start making. So it's big business as well. Now, moving on from the daguerreotype, the ambrotype came along in the 1860s and 70s. Ambrotypes were much cheaper to produce than daguerreotypes even, and because of that you get a further democratization of portraiture. It's democratized to the working classes. The working class can now afford to have a portrait, so you get a rise in cheap studios in the cities and seasides, or even on, you know, in back streets where you can go in and have an ambrotype done of your family. The effects of photography, and sorry about the spelling at the top there, I don't know what's going on there. Photography is ostensibly a broadcast medium. You know, you are taking an image and then you are using it to broadcast a particular message. Now, industrial serial production and consumption of images, therefore, that came from the invention of the daguerreotype and then the ambrotype and so on, you have a genuine industry that comes up. The remarkable thing about the photography industry is it doesn't exist anymore. The photography industry was huge. You know, hundreds of thousands of people worked in the photography industry, and you would think, what did they do? Well, they worked in factories creating cameras, they worked in facilities producing film, they worked in facilities distributing film once it had been taken in to be developed. This thing has wrecked an entire industry because you don't need to do any of those things anymore. Digital photography has actually ended the photography industry in total. You know, nobody needs any of that stuff anymore, and we have world-class cameras in our hands at all times. And this is why we take more photographs year on year than has ever been taken in the history of humankind before. The effect of photography, the third effect, would be the roots of celebrity culture itself. The ability to produce images of the rich and famous became a very lucrative art in its own right. People would collect photographs of famous people in society, like Queen Victoria, for example, or many other people as well involved in, you know, nascent show business or politics or so on. People actually went out and collected these things and displayed them. So you get the first inklings of a celebrity culture and a spectacular economy of images. From small beginnings, photography became a huge industry and a huge economy. You know, the economy itself of photography was massive. And again, I'll reiterate this point about digital photography, but prior to the digital camera, Kodak, who I talked about at the end of the last lecture, so Kodak in the 1990s had 100,000 employees. By the middle of the 2000s, they didn't have any, they were bankrupt. That's how quickly it all fell down. But there were hundreds of thousands of people working for just this one company, and I think they were the biggest in the world at that point in time. But you know, they weren't the only one. There were many millions of people who made their livings through photography as a business, photography as an industry, which has now completely collapsed. What do I mean by celebrity pictures? Well, these kind of things. People would go out and buy images of Charles Dickens or Queen Victoria and display them. It's kind of crazy. You know, I wouldn't be rushing out to get these images myself, but, you know, it was a way, I guess, of owning a piece of an author or a member of the royal family or somebody you really respected and loved. You know, to have a photograph of them was something special. It was a photographic representation, an accurate photographic representation, extremely cheap, you know, so these became really popular collectibles. And very often in this kind of form, the mosaic card, now you'd need a magnifying glass to use it, but you would have like hundreds and hundreds of very famous individuals on one card, so their images would be combined, and then you would sort of look through it and identify all these people on it. In the age before television, this was entertainment, people. So, you know, these were really popular forms of broadcast media. From the 1870s, you get the cabinet card, which is larger and displayed in-house or in an album or something like that. Very famous people, you know, where you have these images which you could collect in books. But what do we want to know about portraiture? Well, what I want to focus on is what portraiture meant in terms of class. So this is an argument by John Tagg and Suran Lalvani, and I think those books should be up for you on Canvas. And really what I want to pick apart here is the idea that the photographic portrait was infused with class strategy. There were aristocratic forms of the portrait which were taken up by middle classes to signal their arrival and their importance in society. The difference being they weren't painted, they were photographs. So they're using the technology and their own class, that is the middle class, scientific and commercial success. So really the photographic portrait in Victorian times became an indicator of the class and values of the middle classes, the bourgeoisie. So, in terms of representation, what does this mean? No representation is ever neutral or accidental. It's always intentional, produced, carrying deliberate and unconscious meaning and values. Plus, in the 19th century, there was a vision of body as a text in itself, which would carry all sorts of meanings. Therefore, the photographic portrait was used by middle classes to promote a particular set of class values. And this is very, very important. And this is the root of the essay question I'm asking about this topic. You know, the middle classes used the portrait form of photography to project a particular set of values outwards, and to have people accept those values as being superior to the ones that they might have had otherwise. It was a mode of class display. There was a ritual ceremony of the portrait in terms of, you know, getting dressed in particular ways, posing in particular ways, structuring the image in particular ways. So if it's of the family, you'd have the gentleman upstanding, the mother in a certain position, the fine-looking children. This unified the class, asserted its identity for its own identification. If you had these images in the home, you could identify yourself as middle class. This is really what it is. And your image would correspond to what other people have done. So there were a set of what they call in semiotics codes being used and signs being used to project a class identity through the production of photographic portraiture. So you're promoting the class and its values in society. So what does this mean? What kind of values are we talking about? Well, the gentleman would always be there to show wealth, status, position, respectability. You'd be photographed in a particular stance, looking in a particular way, even with a particular look on his face. Character was transmitted through these images. Hard work, morality, Christian faith, moral certainty and probity, these could all be transmitted through the gesture, the pose, the the clothing, the hair, the gaze, the facial expression. These were all there. The gentleman didn't smile. The gentleman is serious. He works hard. He's not here to be the source of your amusement. He's a very serious man. The wife and mother, their status, position and respectability were all important. So there was a moral character to how they were captured in imagery. Female virtues were there, but these are female virtues of chastity. These are female virtues of probity. These are female virtues of being subservient to the man within the image, not to be dressed in the same way as the man, to be identifiable as belonging in the home, which means the separation of private and public spheres gets collapsed in the family portrait, because you've got the public man and the private woman here, not showing any kind of extraneous skin or anything like that. No, dressed down to the very, very feet rather than even the ankles, and always in a pose and in a position which marks out the woman as being supportive of, but subservient to the man in the image. If you wonder about children, they were pictured. They were usually at the bottom of the frame, and they were there to be seen and not heard, basically. So photography itself becomes what we call a disciplinary practice, to borrow from Michel Foucault. The visual display is used as a class strategy in this case, to promote a certain set of class values and to force a change in those who viewed it to accept and copy these class values themselves. So the effect of this is to homogenize the middle classes, the bourgeoisie, and assert their status against other classes. And there's a secondary function to this. If we take Thorstein Veblen's theory of the leisure class, where he develops the idea of conspicuous consumption, what we're talking about with photographs is private goods bought for a competitive display. And what he means by conspicuous consumption is that you buy things in order for them to be seen. So a great example of conspicuous consumption is, somebody goes out and buys, a BMW car. I'm like, what do I care? I really don't care about cars. But this person really does. And what does, is the BMW car any better than the little Ford KA? Not really, because they do the same job, right? You go from point A to point B in a vehicle. That's pretty straightforward. All cars do the same job, so why would you get BMW? Because it's a display of status. And this is what the theory of conspicuous consumption is talking about. You get private goods and you use them in a competitive display of where you are in society. So the home becomes a class battleground, basically, and with the idea of the portrait, to have a up-to-date portrait of the family, everyone looking resplendent and displaying their class values for all to see, this became conspicuous consumption. You had that image not just to immortalize your family, but to show other people that you meant business and that you are so middle class, right? You are the most middle class, because look at how you're transmitting these values. It's huge. And this was an underlying function of the role that they served in the portrait served in Victorian society. You might ask, well, what does it serve now? I've talked a little bit about photography in contemporary society, right? We take more photographs than ever. I'll pick up on this in the seminar, but you guys are the best photographers who've ever lived. You're the greatest generation of photographers of all time because you've had so much practice. Can we take anything from the past in order to inform what we do in terms of photography, in terms of portraiture? Well, photography today is not neutral. It's also based on social codes and values. They communicate messages in a public competitive display on Instagram or Facebook or Snapchat or something like that. I mean, the selfie has become a hugely important display of the importance of one's life, one's social value, and one's attractiveness, objective attractiveness, well, kind of objective attractiveness to other people. So the selfie, if you like, is the modern contemporary version of the Victorian photograph. And there are codes that we replicate and so on. We replicate these contemporary cultural codes in them, including such ridiculous ones as soft porn, which people do in terms of selfies as well. And we'll get into this more in the seminar. But Really, the way I want to sum this up is, the portrait as a form started with the aristocracy. When photography was invented by the bourgeoisie class, they took it up as a way of taking over the key ideas underpinning the portrait as an indicator of class and status. They recoded class and status towards their own Victorian values of, religious observance, moral rectitude, and sort of wealth and aspiration and so on. These were coded into Victorian portraits and copied by others to solidify the status of that class. On to the seminars.